Got some breaking news to bring you now, and the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has just tweeted about the situation in Sudan. He has said UK armed forces have completed a complex and rapid evacuation of British diplomats and their families from Sudan amid a significant escalation in violence and threats to embassy staff. He goes on to say, "I pay tribute to the commitment of our diplomats and bravery of the military personnel who carried out this difficult operation. We're continuing to pursue every avenue to end the bloodshed in Sudan and ensure the safety of British nationals remaining in the country," adding, "I urge the parties to lay down their arms and implement an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to ensure civilians can leave conflict zones." So that's from the Prime Minister just there. And the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, also tweeting today too, saying, due to escalating threats against foreign diplomats, the UK has evacuated embassy staff from Sudan. Our top priority, he says, remains the safety of British nationals. We are working around the clock to broker international support to end the bloodshed in Sudan. So James Cleverly tweeting there, and then the Prime Minister in the last few minutes on that escalating violence in Sudan. We can speak now live to our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes. So a lot has happened in the last few minutes, Deborah.
Yes, we've just had this confirmation that we'd really been waiting for. We knew from yesterday that the UK was planning to evacuate its diplomats from Sudan. It's obviously a high-risk operation. It's an active conflict zone. The French said this morning that they were evacuating their staff alongside other partners. And obviously, we assumed that the British were one of those partners. And just now, the Prime Minister confirming that that is the case. The UK military, the UK armed forces went into Sudan and they evacuated not just the British diplomats, their dependents as well, of course, and have left the embassy temporarily closing, it would seem. And the effort, as the Foreign Secretary said in his message, in his tweet, is to work from outside the country now, of course, on pressuring these two warring generals that have triggered huge violence over the last 9 days to cease fighting. But it's going to leave British nationals that are still in Sudan and haven't been rescued. If you didn't have a diplomatic passport, you weren't getting on one of these flights, feeling very abandoned. The UK will say that their diplomats on the ground weren't able to perform their functions, of course, given the threat to life, and that actually by evacuating them, maybe counterintuitively, it means that they'll be able to do more to help the British nationals still in the country. It's such a difficult situation, not just for the UK, but for all countries that have missions in Sudan. They need to help their own nationals, but clearly they have to be mindful of the risk to their embassy staff. And the decision for the UK and others has been to remove those staff and then to work from outside the country to coordinate efforts to help foreign nationals, including British nationals, who are still under fire and still in terror.
And I suppose, Deborah, the biggest problem that the military will face is that the ceasefires that have been in place haven't worked.
No, and actually it's because there's been a relative lull in the fighting over the last couple of days because of this attempt at a ceasefire that was called, that the UK, France, the US and other nations have moved in to evacuate their people. But even with the temporary lull, there has been violations of that. There were airstrikes today. It's not by any sense a safe situation. There were reports earlier as well of one of the French convoys coming under fire during the evacuation. And so if this is what a lull looks like, you can only imagine what it looks like with full-scale fighting, which is clearly what will continue unless a more lasting ceasefire can be agreed. And like the Foreign Secretary has said, that is the UK's priority. If they aren't able to stop fighting, though, then it creates an enormous problem, an even bigger problem for the UK and others, because British nationals are still stuck in Khartoum, and they are wondering what their embassy is going to be doing for them. The embassy now is temporarily closed, and so they're going to probably be feeling quite abandoned, you'd imagine. But the UK is in a really, really difficult situation because, as they've said, it hasn't been possible for their embassy staff to operate as a functioning diplomatic mission in these current circumstances. And they seem to believe that they'll be able to do a better job from outside the country. It's worth noting, actually, that the ambassador was not in Khartoum, hasn't been in the country since this fighting started. But you can only imagine that he's been advising on this whole crisis from London.
Deborah, we have a tweet now from the Ministry of Defence, and they have stated, this is obviously from the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, saying the UK Armed Forces undertook a military operation with the United States, France and other allies. They have evacuated British embassy staff and their dependents from Khartoum due to the escalating threats against diplomats. Now, the operation involved more than 1,200 personnel from 16 Air Assault Brigade, the Royal Marines and the RAF, and he's saying, I'm grateful to all of our partners. So this was, Deborah, a huge operation here.
Yes, and I'm sure we'll get details as to exactly what was used to extract the British diplomats in the next few hours. It's been a mission that the MOD has been planning for a number of days now. The request to go in, the decision to go in, wasn't taken until later, but the military, as always, has this tendency to plan for lots of eventualities. And clearly you can well imagine people inside the permanent joint headquarters looking at the situation unravelling in Sudan and wondering whether they might be called upon by the Foreign Office to go in and extract British diplomats. So they have been working on this. Sudan is a vast...
OK, I think we may have lost Deborah Haynes there, but just to bring you up to date what's been happening in the last few minutes, we've had a tweet, a statement from the Prime Minister confirming that a complex, rapid evacuation of British diplomats and their families had taken place in Sudan. And this, of course, amid significant escalation of violence and threats to embassy staff and the violence that we've seen in the last 2 weeks in Sudan. James Cleverly also confirming that had happened and adding that the duty was to British nationals and making sure they were safely taken from the country. And then hearing from the Ministry of Defence and Ben Wallace confirming a few more details, really, of that operation, saying that it actually involved 1,200 personnel from the 16 Air Assault Brigade, the Royal Marines and the RAF, working in conjunction with the United States and France.